rejoined again by John Pennett. John looks a little bit more relaxed than he did yesterday based on his background.
Absolutely.
So John is the partner in charge of the technology and life science practices at EisnerAmper, and he is going to be talking today about fundraising strategies on the technology side. He covered life sciences yesterday, so we welcome John back. Look forward to your presentation, and let me hand it off to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks for having me again. So the last two presentations that we heard had a fair amount of information about agriculture. So a quick aside. So in addition to being a CPA, I am also a CPA. My dad had a landscaping and lawn service business back in the day, so I had to get a license to become a certified pesticide applicator. My license has expired in that category of CPA, but my accounting license continues. So anyway, thank you for inviting me to the conference, and looking forward to the opportunity to talk with you today a little bit about fundraising strategies. I'll just take a moment to introduce the firm. So EisnerAmper, we're a full service accounting, tax, audit, and business advisory firm. We serve public and private companies. I lead our technology industry practice, which is one of our three principal industry verticals. And we serve clients across the country in a pretty sizable practice. That practice includes the services that you see on the screen here. And we have about 1,250 clients ranging in size from embryonic startups to public companies, with the majority of the company being somewhere in the middle of the bell curve, typically a venture-backed company. Okay. So just to kind of jump into the presentation, so why is it important to think about fundraising for the entrepreneurial company? So the common thread of most of our clients is the entrepreneurial journey. We understand that starting a company is hard. It's going to be far more common to see failures than to see successes. We'd all like to think that our idea is going to turn into a unicorn. That's pretty rare, pretty rare territory to see that. So you have to try to figure out how you can differentiate yourself a little bit. I'm going to provide a little bit of perspective as well. I'm also an angel investor, mostly in health tech and life sciences, but the same principles will apply to technology companies. So I'll give you my views on that portion of it as well. And one of the things I think that's to me is a really nice expression is this quote that I read from Forbes here and included in here. So for a successful startup, they have a product that meets a need, they don't ignore anything, they grow fast, they recover from the hard knock startup life. So being a startup is hard work. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of changes. You have to move quickly, you have to read the market, read what you're doing and how you can change and be able to adapt to that accordingly. Okay. So a couple things to think about before you get into fundraising. Okay. So you want to raise the amount of money that you want to raise is really important to be able to get you to a critical launch point. Okay. So you want to have a very clearly delineated plan in place, all the milestones that you need to achieve to be successful. Development, proof of concept, building your teams, building your commercial organizations, whatever those items are, you need to have a clear and concise understanding of it, a timeline and a budget. And you should raise money to be able to reach the next critical milestone. If you raise that amount of money and make sure you don't raise less than that, you'll be able to hopefully reach a value inflection point where thereafter you'll be able to command a higher valuation of the company and be able to be much stronger positioned to be able to raise that money because you've taken a number of the risks of that potential investment out of the equation. So it takes a long time to build this. You have to think carefully about your budget and the process that you go through. One of the areas that we often see companies probably being a little bit light on is both the time and the cost to get really good talent. So an entrepreneur may have talents in either the development side of the business or perhaps the sales and marketing side of the business, but you really need to surround yourself with a great team and that team is critical to help with attracting investment. It takes time to find those people, to recruit them. They're typically in very high demand, and it takes a lot of money. So combination of equity and cash, all those things need to be carefully budgeted, and those time included in that process. Okay. So you want to raise the right amount of capital. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure you've gotten enough capital in hand to be able to achieve that milestone that's going to be coming up and see it all the way through to fruition. In some cases, we'll see companies will do a larger raise. And sometimes what that does is it puts more pressure on the organization. So if you've raised almost, I'll say, too much money or more than you need for the current activities, you've typically given up a lot more money at an earlier stage. So your dilution is higher than it maybe has to be. You've given up too much of the ownership. There's potential for loss of sort of being on that edge, that entrepreneurial edge of being super efficient and agile in their capital efficiency. So building more things than you need. One of the things that's wonderful about entrepreneurship is the ability to get things done with not a lot of resources and the creativity it takes to get there. Having too much capital can damper that a little bit. The other thing that we sometimes see is we'll see a company will do a priced equity round with perhaps a friend and family member who's a believer and is happy to help out the family member. And maybe that price is higher than it should be at that particular point in time. So while it's great that you did not have to dilute yourself to a large extent for purposes of getting that funding, and it looks great on paper, it often causes more issues down the road as you have to deal with the down round provisions. So when the down round provision comes in, the current investors are saying, the previous valuations were too high, so we need to take shares away from that person to bring them back into normalcy. And so we're only going to put money in if we wind up with our targeted ownership for our targeted dollars, and the rest of you are going to have to suffer accordingly. Those are some painful conversations, obviously, to have with your rich uncle who may have helped you through that process. So let's think for a second about what is the VCs looking for. So I always get back to the first thing is team and TAM, right? So you need to have a great team. At the end of the day, if I don't believe as a potential investor that your team can advance great science or a great technology, then you are not investment worthy. So I have to believe in the team. So that's such a critical portion of it. At the early stage side of things, companies may be bootstrapping. They may have not a lot of cash to spend. And so you may have to ask people to come on board as advisors, maybe for a piece of equity, maybe for future compensation, whatever those arrangements may be. But even if they're just on the board, if they're on board as an advisor and they're to help you, that's part of the team, and that certainly is a critical element to the process. The TAM portion of it is, the total addressable market. So I would typically like to see a large growing market, disruptive technology, significant barriers to entry. And ideally, if I'm investing at a little bit of a later stage, I'd like to see some degree of market acceptance. So there's lots of great ideas. If the market doesn't bear any fruit for it, then that's kind of a waste of time. But in any case, what we're also seeing is, and we've seen this with a number of different types of technology recently, is investors have that FOMO effect, right? The fear of missing out on the next big topic. So whether it's in things like gene therapies or some of the cryptocurrency categories and a whole variety of them, they want to make sure they're not being left out after they've seen some great potential. So at the end of the day, you think about the problem that you're trying to solve, your solution, and to the extent you can get validation, that's going to certainly help to present your situation in the best light. I think it's really important to think about what is a venture capitalist looking to do, right? So venture capital is usually the second investor that's in the company after maybe an angel investor. I'll put the friends and family sort of aside for a second. So an angel investor is obviously a high risk because it's the first investor. Venture capital, usually the first institutional investor, but it's super high risk because it's early stage. So they would like to have the highest return for their investment. And they're looking to get a 7x return on their invested capital within 7 years. Pretty significant return. When you look at the details, it's sort of portfolio theory for that venture capital firm. So a third of the investments provide the bulk of the return, that 7x return is really only coming from a third of the companies. For the other companies, they get their money back. And for some of the companies, a third of them, in many cases, they lose most of the investment. So the transaction didn't work and they just kind of abandoned ship. So they really need to make some great bets to find those 1/3 of companies that are going to provide those superior returns. And one of the things that we see, and we're seeing more and more tranche deals throughout our portfolio, is tranched investments by venture capitalists. So we're going to give you enough money to do a certain amount of activities, and then we're going to reassess. If we like what we see, we're going to continue. And if we don't like what we're going to see, we're going to stop. So the concept is if you're going to fail, fail early and fail cheap. So we can get in and get out if it's not going to work. So how would you think about valuation when you're talking to the venture capitalist? So oftentimes, and we'll get to this in the next slide here, oftentimes at the earliest stage with your angel investors, a lot of times you're doing convertible debt or safe because you don't really know what the valuation is of the company. And therefore, it's hard to assign the equity value that's going to be required. The valuation process it's an art, it's not a science. So we're often asked, can we provide a valuation report for a company to help them in the negotiations? And while we're willing to do that, I usually try to steer people away because that's not really going to be very helpful ultimately in the negotiation. So our view is no better than anybody else's view, and it's going to be based upon, incomplete information. So ultimately, you think about the market opportunity. You think about the management team. If hopefully you have some members of your team that have been there and done that before, and you could use their credentials to help boost your situation. You talk about again the marketplace, the team and the TAM, and one of the key things, and this will really drive you setting your expectations for valuation, is competition. So know who your competition is, know the deals they've done, know the valuations that they have achieved in those deals. So there's lots of places you can get that information. And what that really does is it gives you a range of expectation for what the deal could look like and what the valuation should look like. And then you find where you fit within that range. So it's not an exact science, it is an art, but it is helpful to have a starting place. The competitive analysis is a really good place to start, and then sort of your general benchmarks at the early stage until you get truly priced round. Okay, this is an area you could obviously spend days on, as is this topic here, which is the financing structure. So again, just to mention briefly, at the early stage side of things, we're often seeing convertible notes or safe instruments, which is a way to push the valuation topic down the road. So if you're not quite sure what the valuation is, or you and the venture capital or your angel investors can't decide on the valuation, or as is usually the case, you need the money to achieve a really important milestone. And once you achieve the milestone, you think the valuation will be much higher. So you take the money under a convertible note or under a safe. And then when it's time to, you get the results of your test, your procedure, whatever. If it's successful, then you have a much stronger view to be able to go back to the next priced equity round and say, we've achieved this, therefore our valuation should be higher. I'm going to stop there only because we could spend a whole lot of time going through the different classes of equity and preferred stock and things like that. But I think that's the key point I wanted to get across. So when you do have the opportunity and you do think you're kind of ready, you've kind of thought through your budgets and things like that, and you'd like to go talk to some investors, you really want to think about who you're talking to. So do your homework on who is the appropriate investors to speak to. So if you're at a very early stage, don't talk to a private equity firm or a crossover firm about your particular fundraise. Or conversely, if you're looking for $20 million, don't come and talk to my angel group. It's just too much. So know who the right audience is for your size offering that you're looking for. And then when you have the opportunity and you think about who those folks might be, you want to try to get as warm of an introduction as you can to the groups, but do your homework to make sure that they are interested in your particular category. They don't have a company already in your category that they might feel conflicted out of. And that they're open to your size round in your particular segment of the industry. So target your investors carefully. This also helps when you're doing your competitive analysis to know who's in the game. So when you get ready for the diligence side of things, one of the key things is to have your deal room set up and ready to go. There's lots of virtual deal rooms that people use for their documents. Have it done, carefully indexed, carefully labeled to make it easy for people to come in, look at what they want to look at and make their decisions, and hopefully present you the offer. The cap table is probably the most important. And not only do you want to have the documents in file for the cap table, but you also want to make sure that the cap table is completely filled out the way it's supposed to be. So if you've promised to give equity to persons X, Y, and Z, there is a whole host of tax and accounting reasons, not to mention legal reasons, that you want to get that papered, signed, sealed, and delivered, and stored away. I've been deposed several times over the past few years about founders fighting over how much equity they thought they were entitled to when there just wasn't documentation to prove either of them were correct. Really awkward and unpleasant situations, probably killing a company unless the technology is superior. So you also think about, you want to have your tax information included in your diligence room. Make sure you have your taxes filed. At the early stage, there's not a lot of diligence around the financial statements, but they just want to see that you're being a good corporate citizen and filing your taxes and your W-2s and 1099s. Certainly your IP is one of the critical areas. So have your licenses done, documented in the file. At the early stage side of things in the angel world, we often see companies who are looking to get their license secured from the university and looking for some financial help for that. That's perfectly fine, as long as we know that going in, that the terms are basically negotiated and the amount of capital needed to secure that license is known, then that's a place that we can help provide that capital. For a more advanced company, one of the other key things I think that you want to include in there is know what the key metrics are for your business. So if your model is more of a software type model and things like churn and recurring monthly revenue, things like that are important. Really have a clear understanding of that, provide those metrics, do it consistently over time. If there's anomalies, be prepared to explain it or explain it right in the document. Have your historical financial statements. QuickBooks is fine at the early stage. Just make sure the accounts are reconciled and they're presentable. So have somebody take a look at it to make sure they're appropriate. But the key thing is really the projections, right? So you want to understand, what does the future look like? What does your development cost look like? Your cost to build out your marketing team, your development teams, whatever those may look like, have it clearly laid out. In my mind, if a company cannot clearly articulate that and present that very nice and clearly, then I don't know that they actually know what they need to do to be successful. And that causes me to be very concerned about the ability to invest in a company like that. And just finally, just to finish up here, so obviously we see a lot of alternatives to your traditional angel and venture capital financing. So many companies do not want to have venture capital on their books. They're fearful of too much interference and too much effort required. And there is a lot of other things that can be done. Obviously, everyone starts off bootstrapping, and that's terrific. I think as investors, we appreciate the effort that's put into that and the sacrifice made by the entrepreneurs. That is a key part of the entrepreneurial journey. But you also look at other things. So, depending on the type of company you are, there's the opportunities to share offices, use some of the incubator space. There's some creative equipment procurement models, including perhaps using other people's equipment at universities and other research facilities. You certainly want to take advantage of any of the government or tax incentive programs that are out there. So, certainly there was a number of tax incentives that were put in place and incentive packages around the COVID shutdown. Most of them were around stability as opposed to innovation. But I think as we're coming out of the COVID situation, there's a bit more of a focus going to be on innovation and how can I fuel innovation in my particular state or country. So there certainly are incentive programs out there that should be explored. Government grant programs throughout many different types of technologies exist. And just to finish up on, so crowdfunding is interesting and it works very nicely for certain types of things that usually have a more of a direct connection to individuals. So certain disease states, certain types of technologies. That's been an area where companies have been able to raise some money. You have to think about that strategically because that also often can crowd your cap table and make it a little bit awkward. But it is something that many companies have used to kind of start forward and to progress through the first steps of their development cycle. And then certainly in this current environment, the capital markets have been extremely frothy, and we've seen a number of companies, biotech, technology companies, health tech, going through IPOs and SPAC transactions. So there is enormous quantities of funds that are available. So private equity, hedge funds have enormous caches of money sitting there looking for places to do, and they're searching for really great and interesting technologies. So they've been reaching out to companies that have interesting technology and potentially disruptive marketplaces to see if they might want to participate in a funding, perhaps go into a SPAC transaction. Go into those with your eyes wide open. Now you're a public company and you have all the benefits and detriments that go along with that and responsibilities, but also a great way to get some financing and some visibility for the company. So you go through those things, you keep your eyes wide open, certainly through that process. So I'm going to stop here. This is just has my information, my contact information. We could certainly talk about all of these topics for a day's session on each one of them probably, but we tried to cram it all into a 20, 25 minute or so presentation. So Glenn, I will kick it back to you.
Okay, thank you, John, for your presentation. Very, very informative. Very informative. Really a toolkit for our entrepreneurial audience on kind of how to kind of advance that idea and move forward. How with the clients that you work with, how hard is it to get them to visualize is the wrong word, but kind of center in on KPIs?
So I think I would say it's actually not that difficult
Okay.
because usually people are giving them indication that that's what they want to see. So investors are asking for those things. They think they know something about the industry or what this statistics should be. And it does drive the success of the business. So the customer acquisition costs and the churn and recurring monthly revenues in many cases. Those are things that companies do a great job of presenting. Oftentimes, I'd say they do a better job of that than they do like on the accounting side. So the accounting comes farther behind because that's the visible piece that are being talked about at the board meetings.
Yeah, yeah. On the due diligence side, getting ready, as you said, sometimes the accounts aren't there. How fast do you see people graduating from, say, like a QuickBooks to like the next level up from like a system standpoint?
So I think that's really driven by volume and the complexity of the business. So, I mean, there are public companies who are still using QuickBooks, and that could be adequate for them. So, not the ideal system from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective, but it could be adequate if you build some controls and procedures around it. But I think once your volume becomes sufficient that you really need to do some more detailed reporting, international subsidiaries, which we see throughout our practice, The world is a global stage in terms of talent and customers. So we're seeing many companies. Most of our technology companies have an international component to their business, and that's where you see like the need for more robust systems coming into play.
Now you mentioned early in the presentation the whole concept of friends and family kind of funding, uh, and I'm recognizing that not all entrepreneur ventures make it. Uh, as an alternate, should you have really big families and not ask every uncle right out of the chute, or or save a few for the next idea? What do you think?
Well, I think that's always a challenge, right? So, the family members are typically believers, or really want to help the entrepreneur who's the family member out there. So they'll look kindly towards towards to getting those things organized. Um, it's sort of interesting how oftentimes these things are not very well documented. So as an example, we had a client recently who had a pretty large, it was a seven-figure funding from a family member, and the family member drafted the document. So he drafted it as a convertible note. The entrepreneur never understood what he signed. So when you read the details of the note, you actually had to repay the note and give him the shares as if he converted to common stock. So it was really a double down.
Yeah.
And the entrepreneur just had no idea what he was looking at. And so that was made for some very uncomfortable conversations with his uncle to go back and say, this is just not going to work. We're going to have to recut this. But he put up seven figures worth of funding to get the development. So it was a super high risk that he took. It was risk capital, so he deserves a high yield, higher than a typical, higher than a typical venture capital deal because it was the first dollars in. But it was very onerous term, so it was super high yield.
Well, with all business ventures, and certainly if you consider moving to the public markets, there's an old saying we used to have at the New York Stock Exchange. It's the company that you keep, right? So it's the people like yourself, like your firm, that companies can surround themselves with, that those highly valuable, highly qualified advisors to help them along on that journey that you told us this afternoon. And that's real important.
Right, absolutely. So I think, for many entrepreneurs, maybe they don't have the depth of management team yet. Maybe they're a first-time entrepreneur. And so those are harder for investors to want to back, unless, the science is superior. So they feel like they need to have, some team members who are going to be able to guide the company carefully. So that's where, some people go back to academic advisors or
Mhm.
people who have commercialized companies before, and ask them if they'll join the board and maybe get some equity for that, or for maybe some future compensation, to help provide that that gray hair experience to help provide the mentorship and the guidance, and the confidence to the investors.
Right. Very, very important. Very important. Well, listen, John, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. And